Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video, as part of our Inside the Mind of Bach series, we're going to have a look at one of his chorales. It's number 59 in the Riemann-Schneider collection. Don't worry if you haven't got that, because you can see the score. And the idea is just to have a look at how Bach harmonizes this melody, just to see what's his choice of chords, what's happening with keys, what's happening with notes of decoration, so we can learn something more about the style of Bach, but also learn something more about writing good four-part harmony. So we're just going to look at the first two phrases of this, because you'll be amazed how much is contained within those two phrases. So let me start by playing the first two phrases. So obviously the chorales were sung by sopranos, altos, tenors and basses in the choir part of the Lutheran service. Let's have a look at what he's doing here. First of all, let's just talk about keys. Obviously, this is a chorale that starts in the key of G minor, so the whole of the first phrase is in G minor, ending at that pause, that fermata sign, which doesn't really mean pause, it just means that's the end of the phrase. And then the second phrase, which takes us to the end of this extract, is in B flat major. That's no big surprise, because B flat major is the relative major of G minor, so it's an obvious place to which Bach might modulate. Now, there are a few little interesting touches on the way, particularly in that second phrase, and we'll take those on board any moment now. But the first challenge here, if you were trying to harmonize this melody, is the fact that you've got three tonic notes at the beginning, three Gs. So it's kind of thinking, well, if I had to harmonize that, what would I do? Would I just have three G minor chords? Be a bit boring, wouldn't it? You could maybe start on a tonic chord of G minor, go to the first inversion, come back, something like that. You might think, well, G belongs to chord 1, it also belongs to chord 6, it also belongs to chord 4, so you might go 1, 6, 4. You could even put some passing notes in the bass. And that would be a perfectly reasonable way of harmonizing it. So the point of making that start to this video is not to say that the way Bach has harmonized it is the only way to do it, because just spending a moment there has explained that there are other possibilities, aren't there? And actually other possibilities that like the one we've just demonstrated, going from 1 to 6 to 4, that work as well as what Bach has actually done. So it's not that there's only one way of doing it, but it's interesting to consider what Bach actually did. Well, what does he do? He starts on a chord 1 on an anacrusis, a pickup note there, just starting on the 4th beat of the bar. And quite often when you have these anacrusic starts, it's often the case that you don't start on chord 1. You quite often have chord 5 and then you go to chord 1. But if you're repeating a tonic over the anacrusic start, well, you can't do that. So he started on chord 1, but he's moved to another chord. So he started on chord 1, and then perhaps he thought about using chord 4 next, but he thought, well, we could make that a little bit more spicy by having chord 1 and then having chord 4 7. So you see that B flat in the tenor is the 7th. And another good reason for including that B flat is that he had B flat in the tenor on the first chord, didn't he? So repeating a note as the chord changes is a good way of binding chord movement together. So you've got the repeated B flat in the tenor, you've also got the repeated G in the soprano. So 1, 4, 7. Then notice what he does. He's got passing notes in the alto and the bass part, unaccented passing notes because they come between the beats, but they're going in contrary motion. which is a nice way to write it. It makes for a kind of nice welding of the four parts. And if things are going in contramotion, you don't run into trouble with consecutives and all that joy. So we've got 4/7, lovely rich chord. So you hear the impact of 1 to 4/7. Lovely, isn't it? And it's also another interesting point about this is that we often say in Baroque music, well, where do we expect to find seventh chords? We expect to find 5/7, we expect to find 2/7, other sevenths sometimes happen, but they're not terribly common. Well, I think you'll find if you look at a lot of Bach chorales, you'll find 4/7 comes up quite a bit. Here it is, 1, 4/7, then these double unaccented passing notes in contramotion. Now what happens next? Because when you look at this chord, you might think, ooh, what on earth is this chord? Well, really, what's happening in the tenor is that the tenor has an accented passing note. You feel that A is a bit of a dissonance. Now you could say, well, surely the A is a harmony note, and therefore this is 2/7 in its second inversion. You could say it's 2/7 in its second inversion with a lower auxiliary note going on to the next chord. But really, it feels more like an accented passing note going on to a harmony note. You feel there's a kind of tension, a slight dissonance that resolves. So even though there are two ways of looking at that beat, it's kind of boils down to a musical judgment, doesn't it? Bach often does this though, where you can look at it and say, well, yes, it's 2/7C on the beat. Actually, after the beat, when the tenor moves to that G, it's now a 4B chord. So which is it? In a way, it's both, but you've got to make a musical judgment. And what you feel musically is that the A feels like a dissonance, resolving onto the G. So really, it's a 4B chord. So he's gone from a 4/7A chord to a 4B chord. Okay, now where's he going next? Well, the third beat of this next bar, there's a chord 5. And now we've got a 5/7D. Bach absolutely loves his 5/7Ds, you know, the 5/7 in its last inversion. So you feel how that you get 5 followed by the 5/7D. Often he does this when he has a chord 5, you have 5 first followed by a 5/7 or a 5 that becomes a 5/7. Usually that way round, because if you start with a 5/7 and then you lose the 7th so it becomes a 5, you kind of weaken the chord, don't you? But if you start with a 5 and then you add a 7th, you strengthen the chord. So the progression is strong. So 5, then a 5/7D. And of course, the way we normally resolve a 5/7 is the 7th falls by step, the 3rd rises by step. Here's the 3rd in the tenor part rising into the next bar, the 7th in the bass falling into the next bar. So on we go to a 1B. Now we have a passing note in the alto. Notice that the alto is using E natural. Okay, now when we're writing harmony, we tend to use the harmonic minor scale. The clue's in the title. When we write melody, we tend to use the melodic minor scale. So what happens when you're kind of trying to think melodically and harmonically at the same time? Well, here's a really good example. Why has he used that E natural in the alto? Well, he could have used E flat as part of the harmonic minor, but when it goes on to that F sharp, can you hear what happens there? D, E flat, F sharp. You end up with an augmented second. Now this is a real danger when you're working in minor keys, whether you're in the style of Bach or you're not. You end up with this augmented second between the 6th and 7th degrees of the scale when you're in the harmonic minor. So this is where a bit of melodic minor comes in really handy, because by raising that 6th degree to E natural, you end up ironing out that augmented second. So that's why that's there. Now what's this chord about? Well, this is chord 7, it's chord 7B. Now many people will say to you, oh, chord 7, that's a real pile of trouble. Try and avoid it if you possibly can. Well, you don't need to avoid chord 7 actually, but chord 7 will nearly always work better in first inversion than it does in root position. It's in root position, it's a little bit ugly. It emphasizes the tritone within the chord. Put it in the first inversion, it always sounds better. And in this case, it's part of a replacement passing 6/4, because a passing 6/4 will be when you have 1B, 5C, 1. But you can replace that 5C with a 7B. So here we've got 1B, 7B, 1. So that's what's going on there. Now, the next move is the simplest move, really. He's saying, I've got to chord 1 on beat 3. I'm just going to use chord 1 again. But instead of just using exactly the same notes again, the bass leaps an octave. So at least there's some movement in the bass. So you can either change the chord, or you might be able to move to another inversion or something. But you could just let the bass jump an octave, so you feel that movement. And then we're coming to a cadence. He could have done something fairly straightforward now, like chord 4 and then 1, 5 that he's written. But he's ready for a little bit of spice here. So as we go into the next bar, diminished 7th chord. Isn't that a lovely chord? Diminished 7th in G minor, going 1 to 5 to make an imperfect cadence in G minor. So that's what's going on there. Second phrase begins simply by repeating the same chord. You know, we've finished one phrase, there's a sense of repose on that 5. He uses the same chord then to propel us into the next phrase. So that repetition works quite well, because the first chord 5 is finishing something off, the next chord 5 is launching us into the next phrase. So there's the chord 5 repeated. Then we come to chord 1 in G minor. But remember, we said that we're modulating to B flat major, so we're looking for a pivot chord, a chord common to G minor and to B flat major, so we can affect this modulation. Well, this chord 1 in G minor, well, what's that in G minor? Chord 1. What is it in B flat major? Chord 6. So this is our pivot chord. It's 6 in the new key. So then what does he do? For the second chord of this bar, we're now using chord 7B in B flat major. So it's another 7B. So you see these 7Bs crop up a bit. So 7B going to 1 in B flat major. Double unaccented passing notes, this time going in the same direction. And when they do go doubling in the same direction, normally that's going to work in thirds or sixths. So these work nicely in 6. So we've got 1 in B flat major, double unaccented passing notes, soprano and tenor, and you think, yeah, he's going to go to a B flat major chord. Has he? What does he do? B flat major on beat 3, then we have an A flat in the bass. Now you're thinking, well, what's A flat got to do with B flat major? Well, not a lot. But something's happening here, because from that A flat, it goes into the next bar with a chord 1 in E flat major. So it's going 5-1 in E flat major. To be specific, it's going 5-7-D. That's another 5-7-D chord. It's 5-7-D in E flat major to 1B in E flat major. Okay, well, the 1 in E flat major is also called 4 in B flat major. So this is a secondary dominant. We're going 5-1, or better still, 5-7-1 in another key, but the 1 is a chord in the prevailing key. So here it is, secondary dominant in E flat major. Okay, now you might notice when we get to this moment, Bach has sort of technically infringed a rule. This is a major chord that has a double major third in it, G in the alto, G in the bass, and that's something that textbooks will advise us to try and avoid. Okay, well, try and avoid them, but Bach does sometimes double his major third. So he does it when it's going to create a lovely smooth line, usually scale movement. Well, you see the alto's going up a scale, the bass is going down a lovely chromatic scale, so he doesn't want to kind of interrupt that. So he's happy to double that major third in the interests of the kind of linear movement of the parts. So that's the 1 in E flat major, but it's 4 in B flat major. Unaccented passing note in the alto. then one of the most gorgeous moments in this whole thing where you think, what is G flat doing in the bass there? Oh my goodness. Well, we've just had this chord 4 in B flat major, 4B. Now we've got 4B in B flat minor. So this is an example of a borrowed chord. He's borrowing a chord from the parallel minor. So we've got chord 4 in B flat major with the passing note in first inversion. And now we're borrowing the same chord from the parallel minor. And it gives you a lovely change of color and that chromatic bass line. And a passing note in the tenor, which makes it even more expressive there. Then he goes on to a 1C in B flat major. So you see that previous chord was just borrowed, and then we're back in B flat major. Okay, so there's a 1C. Now you might be thinking, oh, 1C. I thought we weren't supposed to use second inversions other than in particular places. That's true. It's a sort of passing 6/4, not in the conventional sense, but the bass passes by step from the previous borrowed chord to the 1C to the next chord. So it gets away with it, if you like, because the bass line is moving by step. It sort of feels a little bit like a modified passing 6/4. But it's a nifty little touch. Anyway, let's put it that way. So we've got a 1C there. Notice this tenor movement, having had a passing note on the previous beat. Now he just jumps to another harmony note. Coming towards the cadence, another nice touch. Because what's this chord when we get there? It's another diminished 7th chord. So you can see E in the bass, pile of minor thirds, E, G, B flat, D flat. It's a diminished 7th chord. But interestingly, it's not a diminished 7th chord in the key of B flat. It's a diminished 7th chord in the key of F, because diminished 7th chords tend to be built on chord 7. So in the key of F, E, G, B flat, D flat, it's the diminished 7th built on chord 7 in the key of F. So why has he done it in the key of F? Well, we're about to have an F major chord, and the F major chord is the dominant chord in B flat major. So he's used the diminished 7th of the dominant chord, if that makes sense, which is something else he does a fair bit of. So it's a lovely touch. Diminished 7th. Anticipatory note in the soprano, which also happens to convert the diminished 7th to a 5/7B in the key of F. And now we finally get a suspension. Bach loves his suspensions, but we have to wait till the last bar in this one. Can you see in the alto, at the end of the previous bar, we've got B flat prepared, then it's sounded at the beginning of the last bar, you can hear that dissonance, then it's resolved. So it's a 4/3 suspension, prepared here, sounded here, resolved here. And so this chord is chord 5, and then we have a passing note in the tenor that makes it 5/7, and then the final tonic chord of B flat major. So that's really kind of combed through what's going on with the harmony, the use of secondary dominant, the use of diminished 7ths, and the use of a borrowed chord from the parallel minor. So there's such a lot to look at in just 2 phrases of that chorale. So you might want to live with that, and if you're a keyboard player, it's great just to play through these things and play the individual lines as well, so you notice how smooth the movement is in the individual lines, and just to get a feel for how rich this harmony is. And I'll just conclude by playing the whole of these 2 phrases again so you can hear this in action. And if you're interested in doing some more study on writing good 4-part harmony or writing in the Bach Chorale style, have a look at the Music Matters website, where you'll find a course that's dedicated to this very topic. And it's a very standard way for people to really polish their 4-part harmony skills. Enjoy.